good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming along. And can I, first of all, thank the SCI for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here in a room that I've attended many interesting meetings and spoken a few times here as well. So I'd also like to thank Sir Geoffrey Allen, who is largely responsible for getting me in here, an old friend who I keep running into at meetings and still going strong. So thanks very much, Jeff, for inviting me on behalf of your colleagues. So there's the title of my talk: Fossil Fuels and Avoiding Climate Change, Are They Compatible? Because there are great issues, of course, to do with the future of energy and how much we should and can continue to use fossil fuels, and if we do that, does that actually put a nail in the coffin of doing much about climate change? And you might anticipate what my answer to that question would be, but we'll take things as they come. And so what I'm going to do is, first of all, just to give a general overview, the way I see the energy landscape now and into the future. And then I'm talk a bit about the energy transition from where we are now, largely dependent on fossil fuels, to where we hope to be 2050, later in this century, where we need to get as much carbon out of the energy system as possible. And then I'll come back to fossil fuels, which, if you like, is the elephant in the room this evening in terms of the unanswered questions about where should we go with that, where there's great variety of opinion. And then I'll talk about how I think we should manage the elephant. And I'm going to link this because I thought I'd take the opportunity of linking the general issues into what the Institution of Chemical Engineers is trying to do, particularly in the energy space. And so I'm going to talk about how we might engineer this transition from a chemical engineering point of view, and link this to Chemical Engineering Matters, which is the name of the iChemie's technology strategy. And so along the way I hope to show you in a broader sense how chemical engineering matters and how a greater appreciation of that would help in energy and elsewhere. And so I'll talk about the key role that chemical engineers have to play in managing this transition, and say something about what iChemie is doing with some of its groups, and how everybody working together, I think, has a role to play, and even you yourselves this evening. So I'll come back to that towards the end of the lecture. So I'm sure you're all generally familiar with the energy scene, but let me just run through the primary contenders for energy. Of course, we have fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, that for a century or more have been powering our economy. And then we have the more unconventional hydrocarbons that are more difficult to get out of the ground, more expensive, and probably potentially more environmentally damaging, and hence contentious as to whether how much we should exploit them. So we have shale gas, of course, which have been great debate about the pros and cons of fracking recently, tar sands, bitumen, oil shales, which are partially matured hydrocarbons, and gas hydrates, which are ice-like structures that are found in Siberia and in the Arctic, and found in deep in shallow sediments. There's more gas in gas hydrates than all the other oil and gas reservoirs and sources of gas, including shale gas, put together, but it's extremely difficult to extract. If we could extract just 1% of the supposed reserves of gas hydrates, we'd have enough methane to keep us going for hundreds of years. Then we have nuclear, which has been a steady contributor to energy across the world for some time. Fission, which is the current processes where we have conventional fission and then more advanced reactors, which are more efficient, produce far less waste fuel. But there's lots of issues about nuclear, which I will likely touch on as we go through, in terms of both whether how much that's going to contribute to a lower carbon future, and that's very geographical in terms of which countries take a particular view. Then there's fusion, which is always been 35 years away and probably will continue to be 35 years away. And then renewables. And we've got a whole load of contenders here. So there's biofeedstocks, biomass, waste material, hydroelectric, wind, wave, tidal, geothermal. And some of these are widely available geographically. Some are more specific depending on your location. Then, of course, we have solar, both solar thermal, where we use big reflectors to convert the heat energy that is radiant from the sun, and photovoltaics, where we're directly converting solar energy into electricity, which we anticipate will play a major role in the future, already growing quite quickly. So these are the contenders that so it's quite a complex space, and this is my version of the energy landscape currently, where top right-hand corner, current world consumption is about 15 terawatts, and you can see in the middle here that this about over 80% of this is provided from fossil fuels, and the potential for that is still considerable. So I'll say more about the reserves we've got for fossil fuels as to whether that's limiting or not, but here, just at a course level, there's plenty of that left. But then if you go around the other energy alternatives, of which we have provision of all of these, what I've tried to indicate here is what the potential for delivery from each of these is, given that there are limitations. For instance, on biomass, with the land availability, even if we can use second generation biofuels that don't necessarily compete with food for land, that just in terms of the feasibility in terms of available land, you could probably only provide 5 to 7 terawatts. Now this 15 terawatts here, of course, is not a static figure. This is a moving goalpost, and we'll see that this is going to potentially double in the next few decades. So these limitations on the provision from each of these individual energies are quite significant. So currently with nuclear, we've got about 1 terawatt. We could, in principle, build as much as we'd like, but it takes up to 10 years to get a nuclear station on stream, and that's one of the problems now in terms of the decommissioning going on in the UK, that we haven't made provision for continuity of this, and therefore there's a blip. We're going to have to do something in the short term to make up for that. Tidal wave ocean currents, about 2 terawatts. The hydroelectric, of course, very geographically dependent, probably about almost 2 terawatts there. Geothermal, a large amount in principle, but the technical feasibility is questionable of a lot of that. And then if we come wind, probably the most cost-effective currently of the alternatives, onshore wind. There you've got limitations in terms of, again, availability of and suitability of land. Offshore is more acceptable in terms of disruption of the environment, but obviously more expensive. And then we come to solar, where if we could just capture a fraction of the radiant solar power on the Earth's surface, then we would be able to supply all our energy needs for a long time. So efficiencies are very low at the moment, but we don't need tremendously high efficiencies. We just need some sun, and we need the ability to store the energy, and I'll come back to that later. So my message from this slide is that if we're looking to replace fossil fuels, that there's no single contender except maybe solar in the long run, and then you can't actually make all the materials in this room from solar energy. So we've got to consider not only what we do for power, but what we do for manufacturing materials and chemicals and all the things that we've got used to in terms of the quality of life we have here and across the world and others aspire to. So there's going to be no one solution if we want to run down fossil fuels and build the others up. And so for a long time, we're going to have a mixed economy of energy. And so the challenge is, how do we manage that mixed economy and make choices and decisions? And again, this is going to be very dependent on your geographical location, political and social factors, as well as engineering and resource availability. So the driver, of course, for using less fossil fuels is the evidence that is, I think, more and more incontrovertible, that we have man-caused climate change, anthropogenic climate change, as evidenced by the increases in CO2 levels over the last 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution, and the corresponding increase in the mean global temperatures, which is less than a degree at the moment, but on an increasingly upward curve. So the challenge is to actually do something about reversing this quickly enough. And so I'm not going to go any further into that. My contention is that this is sufficiently well established that we would be foolhardy to ignore the evidence and have to do something about it. And I also take the view that if by some small chance I and others are completely misguided about the cause of climate change, most of what we need to do for sustainability and efficiency issues in use of the world's resources. And so I think the argument stands by either camp. So if you look now at the current energy mix globally, this is a few years old, but it hasn't changed all that much. What I want to point out here is that renewables then was about 13%, it's probably about 15% globally now, and that there's a large amount of bioenergy, and hydropower's a significant fraction of what's used, and that currently solar, although it's growing at a fast rate, it's growing from a very low base. And so one of the issues about the implementation of renewables is how quickly can we bring them on stream, how their efficiency can be improved, and how their costs can be brought down so that they're competing with the other forms of energy. So that's where we are roughly. And as I've anticipated, we're going to have major energy demand increases. 2 major drivers, really. One is the world population, that we're currently around 7 billion. The projections are that by 2030 we'll be 8 billion and 2050 9 billion. And a lot of this will be in the developing world that are going to be hungry for energy to grow their economies. The second thing, that there's going to be this major economic expansion of the non-OECD countries. And it's difficult to argue that one should stand in the way of that economic and quality of life improvement if the consequence of that is deprivation of energy, because we can't use fossil fuels, which will be a major source for a lot of those countries like China, India and so on. So the projections are that world energy demand, given these factors, will increase twofold at least by 2050. So that's the moving goalpost and the context in which we've got to actually make some of these decisions. The other thing I might add to this that's related is energy security, that energy security is an increasing driver, not necessarily in the volume of energy that people need, but how they want to actually have some degree of control over where it comes from. And that, again, is a geographical factor that will influence the choices that particular governments and particular communities make. So if we look at the future energy mix, this is one of the IEA's scenarios. You can take your pick of these scenarios. They vary in their assumptions, but qualitatively they give roughly the same projections, even if you go to scenarios that are very business as usual, or that we ramp up renewables and increase efficiency as much as quickly as we can. And this is saying basically, this goes to 2030, not 2050, but here the projection is that still about almost 80% of the world's energy at that point will be provided by fossil fuels. We have a growth of renewables and nuclear. But by the middle of this century, the projections are that we still, in order to supply the world's demand, are going to have to use a great deal, not just a bit of fossil fuels, but the majority of the energy will come from fossil fuels. And so if we don't want to prevent other economies expanding and ourselves go back to an agricultural economy, then I think that's the conclusion one comes to. Just one other thing from this slide is if you take this dotted line here, that's how energy demand would have increased if we hadn't have had the banking recession of 2008. And I think that just indicates that we're not in control of all the factors that affect the way we use energy and the way we behave socially and politically. Wars intervene, economic crises intervene. But I think that does show that once there was a throttling back of energy demand due to the world economy, a substantial effect was made on the use of energy. And so, the economy is, and the price of energy is one lever that governments and individuals have that will affect how much energy we use, which is an important factor in the equation. This is the DEC's fairly recent predictions of how things will forecast in the UK. We're actually doing quite well at decreasing our energy demand, but the projection here by 2030 is that still well over 50% of our energy in the UK is going to come from fossil fuels, despite enormous efforts to actually ramp up alternatives. And by the projection by 2050 is that will have gone down maybe by another 10%, but substantial there. Notice that we don't have as much renewables in the UK at the moment. It's only a few percent, and the government's target is to get it up to where it is globally, 15% by 2030. That's where a lot of the effort is going now in terms of renewables. So coming back to the climate question, in terms of numbers, this is the challenge, of course, that this is the global carbon emissions. This is carbon, multiply it roughly by 4 to get to the amount of CO2. The red line is my version of business as usual. If we do absolutely nothing between now and 2050, then the chances are we're going to be up in this region here where we're going to have a reasonable chance of having a 4 to 6 degree global mean temperature rise. The target used to be 400, and more recently the 2 degree scenario corresponds to 450 parts per million in the atmosphere, and that's what everyone is still striving to do. And some people are getting more pessimistic. I remain reasonably optimistic that this is a challenge that we can rise to. But as we'll see, time is running out. But a significant thing here is at the start of this century, we were down at 375. So capping at 400 would have been challenging. But we have zoomed through the 400 parts per million in May 2013 and still going up. So one has to ask, is this a realistic cap that we should aim for? Or should we, we have to settle for 550. Well, of course, if you don't aim for 450, then if you aim for 550, then you'll end up higher than that anyway. So I think it's realistic to have this as the basis for decision making, and I think that's the basis on which most governments are working under climate change negotiations. So let me just come back to alternative energies. I indicated on that energy landscape, I was not particularly optimistic at how quickly we would be able to ramp up renewables, either in the UK or globally. And this is just a few of the factors that mitigate against instant transition to renewable energy, which a lot of people would like to sort of wave a magic wand, and that we can do that in the next 5 or 10 years. One is that you've got the slow rate of developing technology. A lot of these alternative energies are still embryonic in terms of the technology development, and we'll see that taking some things from where they're nice concepts but not yet proven, that the industrialization period is 5 to 15 years depending on the technology, and also improving the energy efficiency of some of these systems, particularly solar, is it's improving but not happening all that rapidly. And it's not simply a question of how much money you throw at the problem, because science and engineering doesn't work like that all the time, that there there's understanding that has to be gone through and converted into technology. Bringing the cost down, if we want this to be purely market driven, that would be nice, then these things could compete, and certainly making things comparable with fossil fuels without the need for subsidies would be a scenario to aim for. But the comparability, as you'll see, that I developed the argument that I think we ought to be looking at, is not with the cost of fossil fuels now, but with the cost of fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, because that's the real cost of low carbon fossil fuel technology. We'll come back to that. There's availability, delivering sufficient capacity, and I spoke earlier about the fact that we have limitations of even in the current energy usage of providing all the 15 terawatts we need from a combination of these technologies, let alone what we will have in 25, 30 years' time. A major block is coping with intermittency, and this is the great advantage that fossil fuels have in terms of being able to deliver baseload capacity and to respond very quickly to changes in demand, and availability all the time, whereas of course some of these renewable energies are only available when the wind blows or when the sun shines. And so we've got to find a way of feeding this stuff into the grid at the appropriate time, and energy storage is a major challenge. So if we're looking at engineering challenges, then I would say the overriding one that will cross all these technologies is improved energy storage, and being able to do this at grid scale. So we're all used to the fact that battery technology drives our lives now. We always all carry these devices around, and our lives increasingly depend on, as your memory fades, most of it ends up in here, and it's your ability to have the dexterity to recover it that limits some of the things that you do. So, but how we can transfer this to the grid scale, and there are large-scale molten salt battery technologies being developed, supercapacitors technologies, materials that have energy storage embedded within them. So people are looking at car chassis and flame fuselage that actually have supercapacitors built in as a method of energy storage. But I mean, to do this at the megawatt and gigawatt scale is the real challenge, I think, and I think that's something that scientists in general and chemical engineers in particular have got a lot to offer in the future. And then nuclear, I believe that nuclear should play a much bigger role in the future, but every time there's an accident like Fukushima, that sets nuclear technology back a decade, and I think engineers have got a role to play to keep that on the agenda, and to point out that we shouldn't build nuclear reactors on geological faults necessarily, but that the management of the risk management of these things needs to be much better. Waste disposal is an issue, but most of that concern is about legacy waste, where many countries, including our own, have not sorted out how to actually permanently dispose of all the nuclear waste from the last few decades. And although pebble bed and advanced high temperature nuclear reactors produce only about 5% of the waste that some of the earlier reactors produced, so that the legacy from them is not going to be nearly as large. I think a lot of decision making is based on the fact that we haven't sorted out the past. And then of course there's the issue of proliferation and the misuse of nuclear energy, which is always a concern in terms of how much this should be developed and controlled. So I just want to say a few words about renewable technologies and where they are. And I think one good example is biomass, and that for fuels and power and heat, where we have 4 generations. The first generation is the use of plant materials like sucrose and wheat to produce ethanol, which is the US had a big push a few years ago on producing bioethanol from wheat. Brazil produces a lot from sugarcane, and in fact has one of the lowest carbon footprints of South American countries because it's got a large amount of biofuels from sugar cane, and also it's got a lot of hydroelectric. So that just shows if you've got particular natural resources and you choose to use them in a particular way, for its GDP it has a particularly low carbon footprint. Likewise, France has a low carbon footprint because it has 80% nuclear compared with other European nations. But I digress. That competes with food, and so second generation of using cellulosics and being able to digest cellulosics, convert those to fuels is a much better technology route, but still less developed. And then we have third and fourth generation, which third generation is largely to do with algae and how you can extract. I do some research on algae myself. I think wonderful things that you, from cradle to grave, you can actually get energy out of algae when they're living. They're very good at photosynthesis and converting water into hydrogen because of the inbuilt enzymes, and then you can extract bio-oil from their husks when they've given up, and then you can actually combust the husks when you've extracted all the oil. So they can actually give you energy all the way through, and they reproduce very, very quickly. So I think there's a lot of projects of that sort across the world. And then fourth generation is better technologies of going, rather than going to indirect methods of using solar energy, for instance, of going directly from solar energy to fuels and mimicking biosynthesis in artificial systems. And that's a lot of good research on that, but it's way down here. So what I've drawn here is where are we on the technology maturity curve compared with where we need to be in 2050 if these technologies are to make a significant contribution. So this is where we are now compared with, where we need to be then. So biotechnology and biomass and fuels are going to make a significant contribution, I think, but again, there's the rate of technology development that's an issue. This is a roadmap from the PV industry itself, and this shows that their expectation is that between now and 2050 that they will be providing about 11% of the world's energy then. So even the industry itself is not expecting to provide more than about a tenth of the global needs, despite the amazingly fast increase of efficiency and bringing down of cost. But of course, this is easy to do at small scale, and again, if you want large scale generation, there are challenges there. So I've put on this slide those and other technologies to show that we've got technologies all the way down here from solar fuels all the way up to energy storage devices at the small scale that I talked about earlier that are on this maturity curve. And the challenge for 2050 is to get as many of these up this curve to the right-hand side as we can. And investment and technology will help with some of those, but others are simply part of the either the rate of scientific understanding for new developments or the rate at which you can put things through the commercialization process. So let me come to I realise my watch has stopped. So what time is it, Brian? It's 7 o'clock now, is it? Yeah, right. That'd be useful, yeah. Keep an eye on things. Thank you. This is, I find, a very useful slide to help me look at where we're going in the future. So this is another of the IEA's scenarios. What this shows is the CO2 emissions as a function of time. And the top here is the business as usual scenario, the one that I said would get to 1,000 parts per million if we didn't do anything. And we can see that by 2050 we'll be emitting 62 gigatons of CO2 per annum. Currently it's now at about just over 32. The bottom of this curve is the 400 parts per million scenario that we're trying to aim for to keep it at 2 degrees. So the difference between these two is the amount of CO2 we've got to take out of the system between now and 2050. And if you look here, this has been split up into what is reasonably feasible in terms of different ways of taking carbon out of the system. And there are basically three ways we can do that. The first is to use less energy and to make our energy systems as efficient as possible. And that's something which goes all the way down from power generators to us as individuals, because some of it is currently a matter of personal choice, and some of it is a matter of technology. It's a matter of which cars we drive, what we do with our houses, all those things. And that's about 50% of this CO2. So if we actually could be both minded and incentivized to actually take all the opportunities for using less energy, both in this country and across the world, the predictions are that we could take out 50% of the CO2 that we need to. Another 20% is renewables. And so we've talked about how far we're likely to get in 2050. So if we do, the quite reasonable scenarios suggest that we can get another 20% out from renewables and another 5% from nuclear. Now, I believe that nuclear will grow perhaps quicker than that. But that leaves another 20% that we can't get by any of those other routes. So if we continue to use fossil fuels, then the route to taking that out is carbon capture and storage, that wherever we produce CO2 centrally, we have to take the CO2 out of the system. And you'll see in a minute, I think there are other ways that we could do that. But so the target is 20%. So of that extra, if you look at the difference here, that's about 50 gigatons that we've got to take out of the system by 2050. So 10 gigatons of CO2 per annum is the target for the use of fossil fuels, how much we've got to then take out with CCS. And I think that's a useful figure to bear in mind. So how do we actually continue to use fossil fuels, as I believe the scenarios show, and I believe we must, if we're to actually manage this transition? What we've got to do is to start to think now about how do we take carbon out of the system using fossil fuels as early as possible. So with the fossil fuel resources, as I've said, that there's ample fossil fuels in place. So, and people talk about peak oil. Well, I think conventional oil and gas hasn't peaked yet, but may well do in the next decade or two. But behind that, there's lots of unconventional oil and gas, which is more difficult to get out of the ground, but can be used if we need to use it. And so my Fred Flintstone on the right there is that just as the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone, then the fossil fuels era is not going to end because we run out of fossil fuels. It's going to end because we take decisions to stop using it, and that we use it for materials in a controlled way rather than using it for energy and power. So what we should do is we should deplete those fossil fuel resources as slowly as possible, and as a part of the energy efficiency process. And in terms of feedstocks for chemicals and fuels, then I see a progression of going from naphtha as the main feedstock to gas. The cleanest fossil fuel gives out half as much CO2 as per unit of energy as other fossil fuels. Maybe as a transition, some people see that a gas economy is the way to go for the future. And then to renewable feedstocks, so using biofeedstocks more and more. But of course the challenge for we here at the SCI, the challenge for the chemical industry is to reinvent a whole industry based on biofeedstocks that's currently based on fossil fuel-based feedstocks. This has implications for processes, for catalysts, for transformation processes, everything. So it's a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity. And it's something that the chemical industry is well aware of, but other people, the debate's often about power and heat rather than about how we have the materials that we need. So the other thing is, as I've said, that we need to take out CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are really centrally. It's very difficult to take the CO2 out from a tailpipe at the present, although with catalytic converters, I mean, that technology should be feasible. But what we've got to do is to engineer the environmental impact for the fossil fuel sector so that what we can't do about fossil fuels is to make them renewable. They're a depletable resource, so we can't grow them. It takes several million years to get them there. So on ours and any future generation timescale, what we can't say is that they're renewable. But what we can do is to actually, where we use them centrally, reduce their carbon footprint so that it's no bigger than most of the other alternatives that are on the spectrum. And that's what we should aim to do. And to regard this low to zero carbon bridge to renewable energy is, you could say, well, it's buying time, but I think it's buying a long time. This is not something that we're going to do for a few decades. It's something that we're going to have to do for most of this century, I believe. And so investment in technologies that use fossil fuels but take the carbon out as much as possible, it isn't that we don't have the time to do it. We've got plenty of time to do it. And I think the investment level in looking at that is not as much as it is maybe in developing renewables. And I think if we focus entirely on renewables and trying to accelerate that timescale more than it's feasible to do, we shall miss this bridging opportunity. It will be too late. There may be no habitable areas in some parts of the world to actually use the renewable energies once they come on stream if we haven't managed it in the transition. You'll see that I get on a soapbox from time to time and I'll come down a bit, but I do feel quite strongly about some of these things. So the way that we achieve a low carbon future using fossil fuels, I think, is threefold. We use less energy, we use more gas as quickly as possible, and I don't see that simply reducing the amount of CO2 from gas is an excuse to simply release it. That still doesn't take away the need to have carbon capture and storage, but it means that you need your carbon capture and storage technology is more efficient because it's capturing half as much CO2 per unit of energy out of the system. And so the third thing I've talked about. And so let me just say a bit now about, some of you know about carbon capture and storage, some maybe not so much. So I'll just say a bit about that. So I see two major ways of decarbonisation. One is short to medium term, which is carbon capture and storage. So we need to do this at large concentrations of use of fossil fuels, which is either the power sector or, again, something that is less spoken about but is equally productive of CO2, and that is the manufacturing sector. So cement and iron and steel are enormous producers of CO2, and so carbon capture and storage built into those, there's actually different ways you can do it with industrial processes that, for instance, you can capture CO2 on calcium oxide, which is a key component of cement. And if you actually use it for one and then you dispose of it in the other, there are ways that you can actually close the loop quite effectively. So this is, if you like, decarbonising after we use the fossil fuel. Now there is a process, pre-combustion, where what you do is you burn the fossil fuel and take the, you take the carbon out as CO2 out of the fuel. Say you reform gas and convert it to carbon dioxide and hydrogen, and you take the CO2 out at that stage, and then you burn the hydrogen as fuel. But that's still really taking the CO2 after we've gone into the use stage of the fossil fuel. And so there's great controversy about carbon capture and storage because there's a lot of myths about carbon capture and storage. And I've given a lecture over the years which I've called Carbon Capture and Storage False Hope or Inconvenient Truth, because this is a Greenpeace document that calls carbon capture and storage a false hope because they say the technology isn't proven. Well, the technology has been around for decades because CO2 capture has been practiced in the chemical industry and scrubbing for a long time, and the injection of gas into underground reservoirs has been practiced in the oil and gas industry for 50 or more years. So the technology is there, it's simply the political will to bring them together. And then the inconvenient truth, of course, comes from Al Gore's book and video trying to bring to the public's attention this crisis of global warming and to make clear that it really is a crisis that is actually creeping behind us with feeling that we've got lots of time to do something about it, whereas in fact we haven't. And so carbon capture and storage involves at central resources capturing the CO2 by some chemical or physical process, then releasing the CO2 and compressing it and transporting it to bury it in one of three sorts of underground storage zone. We have depleted oil and gas reservoirs, we have deep saline aquifers, and something that's not talked about as much but is potentially very effective in parts of this country and elsewhere in the world is depleted or unminable coal beds. And some of these have got an advantage that if, for instance, you put CO2 into coal seams, then the CO2 absorbs preferentially on coal compared with methane, and you release the cleanest fossil fuel. So if we want an alternative to shale gas is to actually inject CO2 into unminable coal seams, and then we get the CO2 out by another source. And that helps pay for some of the storage, but it gives us a cleaner fuel as well. So at the bottom of this slide is what I see in I'm working on this and others as well, some of the energy companies working on this, medium to long term, to actually, rather than taking the CO2 out after we've taken the fossil fuel out from under the ground, to actually take as much of it out as we can underground and only bring to the surface what we actually want to need. Now this is basically taking a lot of the processing we currently have on the top sides and the separation and the refineries downstream and taking that into the underground wells. And some of you will know that oil wells nowadays are not vertical wells that go in, they're horizontal wells that are kilometres of sort of roots underground like a tree. And so we have all these tubular pathways that are currently used just to take the oil and gas back to the surface, where we then, so we spend a lot of energy getting it up to the surface, we lose the in situ energy it had, we then put a lot more energy into processing and refining it, and then we put a lot more energy into capturing the CO2 after we've burnt it or produced it in the manufacturing process. So can we actually go back in the chain and do better than that, to remove the CO2 prior to use, and instead of actually using energy on the surface from other sources and producing CO2, to use some of the in situ energy, say of the heavy oil, which is fairly low grade, to actually power some of those processes, so you combust that in situ to actually drive some of these processes. So this is in situ processing, where what you're producing at surface is low carbon fuels, hydrogen, methane, some what do I do here? Thank you for the right answer. And you could have cut your losses and said yes. So fuels that we want to use, we waste an awful lot of heat, and we could generate electricity in situ there. And then for feedstocks, what this involves is that you gasify a lot of the heavy oils that are basically solids. So why put a lot of energy in to convert them into liquids and produce them like we produce conventional oil and gas, when they're more like coal, and we could do what has been done in coal more than any other thing, underground coal gasification, and convert this into syngas, which you can either convert to CO2 and hydrogen, or you can use it to actually produce fuels and chemicals as a cleaner feedstock for the chemical industry. So I think that will take decades to produce, but as I've said before, I think we have got decades to make some paradigm shifts in the way that we think about recovery of fossil fuels, to actually have some longer term solutions that are a bit more constructive than simply burying the CO2 safely for long periods. Let me come back to this scenario where I concentrated here on what we need to do by 2050 to actually get as much CO2 out of the system as possible. That's all very well, but the problem is actually here. All these scenarios are based on the fact that we start to actually ramp up the energy efficiency, the renewables, and taking CO2 out of the system now. And so we can't have a low carbon future unless we have a lower carbon present. And I think, again, this often gets lost, that there's some assumption that we develop technology and we've got plenty of time then, because all we've got to do over the next few decades is, as long as we get to this point by 2050, we're okay. We're not. Because if we don't do it, then it means that all these assumptions about how much energy efficiency we built into the system, how much renewables we're using, will go. So if we are less good at improving energy efficiency and less efficient at introducing renewables, we'll have to use more fossil fuels, which will mean that the demands on carbon capture and storage won't be 10 gigatons, which is a fraction of the CO2 that we produce from fossil fuels. It will be more than that. So the message I want to put, one of the messages about carbon capture and storage, is that we don't have to capture all the CO2 that we produce from fossil fuels. We have to capture enough to maintain the balance of the atmospheric levels at a level that we're comfortable with, or at least the planet's comfortable with. And so let's see, how are we doing in this challenge? 1990, Kyoto, we had 2.39 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of oil equivalent released. 2010, 2.37 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of oil released. So the same. You know, in terms of overall release globally, we haven't made any improvement. However, there are some glimmers. I talked about Brazil and France, where you have local footprints. And what happened in the US with shale gas is that atmospheric CO2 levels increased by a much lower rate than they had previously. And so, although what's happened now with the oil and gas prices is that shale gas, rather than environmental concerns locally being the major block, it's now not a viable industry. So people that have invested money are now losing a lot of money because they've got to backtrack. So this is a foretaste of what we might do if we produced a lot of gas in terms of the impact on the climate. But we can see if the market simply drives that, then like the banking issue in the 2008, it's a temporary effect that's business as usual is resumed fairly quickly. Despite all that, in a non-CCS world, we are not stabilising CO2 levels from fossil fuels. And that's the thing we've got to change. If you look at the magnitude of the challenge, this shows the number of projects that capture about 1 million tonnes of CO2 a year that we need to put in place to meet this 10 gigatons of carbon per annum by 2050. Currently, we have, I'd be stretching it if I said we had 15 projects worldwide at that scale. Now, I'm being generous about that. There's lots of smaller scale projects that may grow. By 2050, we've got to have over 3,000 projects in place of comparable scale. So that means that from 2020, we've got to introduce 100 projects a year. So we've got to have more CCS projects coming on stream than China builds power stations in a year in order to actually do this. So that's extremely challenging. Now, I think the momentum is increasing and more countries are buying into it, and I think I'll say just a few words in a minute about the potential advantages of getting into this technology. But, you know, it is challenging. So just to take that 10%, 20% out, we've got to actually have all these projects. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to get to the end. But there's a lot of myths about CCS as to why we shouldn't do that. I said that you can't capture all the CO2. Well, we don't need to capture all the CO2, as I've indicated, but we do need to do it much quicker because we've got 2 competitions in this country that have taken several years to go through the system. The government's aim is once these 2 pilot projects have been shown to be delivered, that then the commercialisation will drive the cost down and we shall develop an industry that will be very, very beneficial. But I think the investment going into this is not enough soon enough. Cost, it'll add 25% to the electricity cost. So it does cost you money, which effectively takes power away from electricity in order to actually take the CO2 out if it's from power stations. So there will be a cost, and the estimates vary. But I mean, 25% is not unreasonable depending on the technology you use. So electricity from fossil fuels with CCS undoubtedly will cost more. There's no free lunch. But so will electricity from all the other sources, and particularly from a lot of the renewable energies that are coming in that are still quite costly and require a lot of subsidy, and when those subsidies are removed. So I do believe fossil fuels plus CCS is the most cost-effective short-term solution we've got to do something about this problem. And the economics backs it up as well. This is a study from the US in 2009 that if you look at electricity costs in 2050, without CCS they'll go up over 200%, with CCS almost a third of that. And that's not just the US. The figures in this country as well, the IEA's figures show that we'll have to pay at least 50% more for the cost of getting to low carbon by 2050 if we don't invest in CCS. And this is a UK study from a multi-party group of MPs in a report called Carbon Connect. I've put this up because I quite like that slide actually, how they've cleverly used electricity to put all the contenders I had on slide 2 on there. You notice they've got storage on here, which is good. I presume they mean carbon storage, but interconnection and the grid system and storage and everything else is going to be absolutely critical. But they reckon that if we don't do CCS quick enough, that we're going to actually cost us between $30 and $40 billion by pounds. We haven't got to the dollar in this country yet. By 2050, which is an enormous amount compared with the costs of. It's estimated that to do this is going to cost us about $250 billion. But this is a fifth of that cost on top if we don't do something about CCS. And that's for two main reasons. If we don't do CCS and we continue to use fossil fuels, we can't. So we have to take fossil fuels out of the system. So we have to bring more costly renewables in earlier, like offshore wind or even onshore wind. And the second thing is that the failure to actually reduce emissions from industrial processes if we don't put CCS on those. And unless we change to biofeedstocks, then there's no alternative to that in terms of we can't feed wind and sun into chemical reactors. So this says that we need to pay for it, we need more enhanced oil recovery, that rather like getting more methane out of coal mines, we can get more oil and gas out of the depleted reservoirs. We can't get that out of all of them, and I think it's a red herring in terms of that as being a source to actually pay for it. We've got to actually accept it's going to cost more, and we've all got to pay for it. People say it will prolong the use of fossil fuels. I don't believe it will. I think we either meet the energy demand or we don't. We should not hold back at all in introducing renewables and energy efficiency as quickly as possible. That should be absolute priority. What I'm saying is, even if we do the best we can feasibly do, we still have to go down this route. It takes investment away from renewables development. Well, I don't believe that either, because I think, apart from, one could argue there's an issue about subsidies, but in terms of the technology development, that's entirely separate. And the CCS is all added cost. Well, a CCS industry could be bigger than the oil and gas industry, given the amount that we have to store globally. And so, given that in this country we are some of the leaders in technology, there is as long as we grow it quick enough, there's the provision of jobs, the selling of technology solutions and expertise and exporting of that. And but we need to sustain our position early in the game to actually maintain that. So I'm going to move on to, because I'm conscious of the time. My research, although I spent 20 years in oil and gas with Schlumberger, as our chair pointed out, so my passion is in how we use fossil fuels for the next century, but use it cleanly. A lot of my work, I've run a centre in carbon capture and storage. I believe in exploring how we can actually take most of the CO2 out underground rather than taking it to the surface. But I also do some work in the renewables area in terms of green algae and cyanobacteria, and producing hydrogen and methanol from feedstocks like water and CO2. So this is where we are now. This is what I showed you at the beginning. That's where we need to get to in 2050 or beyond, with most of our energy coming from solar, but I believe we will still have some contribution from the mixed economy, and fossil fuels won't disappear completely from the map as I've got here, because it will play a role in continuing to produce chemicals, fuels and materials. So let me spend just a few minutes at the end, Chair, if I'm all right for a few more minutes, about how do we engineer this journey, particularly from the point of view of a chemical engineer. And I mentioned that we have this technical strategy called Chemical Engineering Matters, which takes 4 vistas, landscapes if you like. Energy is one of them, but water, food and nutrition, health and well-being, the big global challenges are the others. And then we look at how the underpinning issues of chemical engineering, safety and risk management, the education and training, the research, and then the interfacing with the world that the technology has to be implemented in affects all these things. And any of you that were at my presidential address last May will know that I have many vices, but probably the most public of them is that I'm a Stoke City supporter. And this was the day in 2008 when, after 25 years out of the top division of British football, we stormed into the Premier League with an amazing 1-1 draw with Leicester City. And so I don't suppose many people were thinking about the chemical engineering mattered, and I was in the main stand there. I probably wasn't thinking about chemical engineering matters. But if you take this group here, taking a selfie, all the materials to do in their mobile phone, produce the plastics and the electronic devices, have a chemical engineering input into the materials and the processing. Their Stoke City shirts, replica shirts and their trainers, the polymers and materials that go into that, all chemical engineering has a big input. If you take the state of the pitch, which wasn't very good after everybody had trampled on it, but before that, pretty good condition, the agrochemicals that go into the fertilizers, the nurture of the fantastic pitches we have nowadays. If you look after the match, they doubtless went to celebrate with a few pints, and so all the beer and wine that they were drinking that evening has a stronger and stronger chemical engineering input in terms of the production and processing. And the next morning when they were recovering them, the medicinal products they needed from the pharmaceutical industry have a key chemical engineering input as well. So wherever you look, you can do the same in this room, you could do it wherever you are. Chemical engineering and chemistry and the industrialization of chemistry matters in everything we do. And that is often forgotten in the discussion about where we go in the future in terms of using fossil fuels and alternative materials, as I've said. So this is the sort of quality of life matrix in our strategy, which says that we've got these 4 major challenges that are all concerned with the quality of life, as much in the developing world as in where we are here, and that these are all the aspects of chemical engineering that go into actually turning some of these things into a reality. And we've got these vistas. Now, you can't read this. I can't even read it from here. But basically, this is the energy one. It says, on the left-hand side, this is where we are now. And the reason I'm raising this is it's to do with the story I've been telling previously in the evening. This is where we are now. This is where we're going to be in the fairly near term. And we roughly know that because if we don't have the enabling technology now, then it won't be there in the next 10 or 15 years. And this is where we want to be on the horizon. This is the game-changing stuff that I'm talking about, where we'd like to be with energy in the next 30 or 40 years. And so a challenge is, how are we going to get from there to there? And we use this as a landscape, a terrain, to say, what are the best routes over this energy landscape? What are the optimum routes in terms of carbon footprint, energy costs and everything else? But where are the missing elements, like energy storage, that we need to solve if we're to get there? And so it's a mechanism for bringing the chemical engineering community together, say, where are you working? Where do you think the challenges are? Where individually and corporately do we need to put effort in? And those are some of the things that you can't read that are relevant to the sort of work I'm talking about, either involved or others that I'm working with. And so the issue is, how do we engineer this journey and avoid catastrophic climate change? Well, we complain a lot about the fact that politicians don't listen. Everybody's relatively unaware and complacent. But I believe that engineers and scientists, not governments, are the key. And I would say this, wouldn't I? I think chemical engineers are a very important part of this picture. And I think there's 3 stages to this journey. There's planning the journey, so finding the routes, the optimum routes across this landscape that will get us there with minimum risk and highest value and minimal carbon input. Then there's providing the innovative technical solutions that are currently missing that will enable that journey, either in the development stage or the implementation stage. And then something else I want to finally emphasise, I think it's public engagement. And that's both with the public and the government. And I believe that it's very important to actually make the public more aware and provide the evidence and the explanation of this, because I think we can talk to governments. I think governments are getting better at listening, but they still don't get some of it. And but I think governments listen to the public. And we're going to go through a process in the next 2 months where this is very evident, that the issues that come onto the agenda are those that are basically driven by what the public thinks are important. So until the public thinks that doing something about climate change, knows that there's no free lunch and we've got to actually pay the costs of it, I think governments are doing a disservice to the public by not letting them know that and leaving it to future generations to find out. And it'll be our children and grandchildren that pay the cost of this if we don't act now. So I think the best route to the governments are, 1, through changing public opinion, and 2nd, through talking to people about their grandchildren, because most people are very concerned about their grandchildren or their grandchildren's children. So I won't say much more about this, because this is just how do we plan our way across this landscape. All I point out is that chemical engineers, a great part of what we do is systems engineering, to take the overall picture. So we're very good at actually linking the different parts of processes and systems together to actually take a holistic view. And energy is such a system that unless we do that, we will, I think, fail to grasp the opportunities by looking at it in that holistic way, because all these issues I've talked about are all intimately connected. And if you move one piece in the jigsaw, then it will influence other things. There's lots of technical solutions that chemical engineers can provide, and I've emphasised grid-scale energy storage devices as one that I think, if the technical community between us can solve that more quickly, then we'll be able to bring in renewables collectively more quickly, because the need for base load carbon fuels won't be there. This is another of the diagrams from Chemical Engineering Matters that shows that technology is not enough unless you actually seek to influence the policy framework whereby technology, particularly in the energy space and the health space, is implemented and inform public attitudes. Then you're only tackling part of the problem. And so I just ask, how serious does the problem have to get before people realise that we are in a war? It's a hidden war, it's a chemical war, and the longer we leave doing something about it, and the longer we fail to mobilise resources both in the UK but internationally, as we would do if we had a military conflict. We're very quick to do that, or if we have a banking crisis, it appears we can do things very quickly. But if we have a crisis of this sort, there's not quite the same urgency, and I think it needs to be expressed. And so the third thing, that comes back from my final point too. I think that what we've got to do is to influence the political agenda and the public information, that we have to be heard to communicate effectively. And we need to do this by the various bodies we belong to, not acting separately but acting corporately together. We need to engage with government where we get the opportunity to actually give evidence or to be consulted, but then perhaps to be more proactive in saying, you may not want to listen, but this is the truth. And then get involved in public engagement in different ways. And IChemE has a media envoy scheme where people
who feel particularly moved to actually stand on platforms, that we put them forward as role models to actually put this forward. But we need to actually be more effective in our communication. A lot of the time we're talking to ourselves and we use technical language which we understand, but governments and the public do not understand. So by mind your language, I mean demystify things. Don't be afraid to actually say things. So, to actually stand up and say on Newsnight we're sleepwalking into a catastrophic climate change future, and be prepared to actually give some of the simple evidence for that, to actually get these things over. I think all these things, opportunities that are not any body, nobody else is going to do it. The only people who are going to do it are scientists and engineers and members of the public who share the concern and come at it from a different perspective, because this is not something that nobody is immune from this, and everybody who I think has a view and wants to be active can do something about it. So my final message is that every individual has a role to play, to speak out, and I've slightly changed the Lord Haig's message there for the chemical engineering community. And so I've tried to do something about some of the things I've spoken about this evening by every day of the year of my presidency. I have 1 year as president of IChemE, and I have a daily blog called ChemEng365 where I put a good news chemical engineering story about. So I want to actually get the energy message over, but I also want people to see that chemistry and chemical engineering affect everything in our world, and for more people to realise that and appreciate the consequences of not going down some of the routes that we're talking about. This was my one on day 163 about it's not just the polar bears at risk, it's humans. So that if you have some good news stories, I'd be welcome those. And I'm not above bribery. I've got some very collectible ChemEng365 batteryless torches here. So Trevor Bayliss would be proud of me. And these torches, if you give me a germ of an idea that may go onto my blog, then I'm happy to donate one of these items. As I say, they'll become very collectible over the years. And another thing we're doing is that we have 6 or 8 energy groups that often, one's fossil fuels, sustainable, renewables, nuclear, passing different messages. If we can't pass a coherent message so that governments and interested stakeholders can get clarity over some of these complex energy issues, how can we expect people to listen? And so we launched last week an energy centre that will provide a debating forum where we will bring together chemical engineers from different parts of energy to produce green and white papers that can actually produce evidence-based views as to how we can actually contribute to the overall energy debate and work with other professionals on this. And so this is the energy centre that was launched at the Royal Academy last week. And it was simultaneously launched here in the UK, in Brisbane and in Kuala Lumpur, because more than half our members now are outside the UK, because chemical engineering, like all other engineering professions, is boundaryless, and the issues we're tackling are global. So make your voice heard. On this slide there's different ways that all of us can make our voice heard, not only on energy but things that are concerned. My concern about the energy issues in this election are that it's all about keeping the cost of energy low, when we know that that is a disingenuous approach by whatever route you go by it. And so the sooner the debate is open to how do we actually share, taking social factors into account, the increased costs of energy, and doing it in this way, the better. And so my final slide, Chair, sorry that I've gone on longer than the hour, but I thought I couldn't end by what can I do? And by I mean you and me. So we can engage in the energy debate wherever we get the opportunity. We can play our part with energy efficiency. I don't know whether you notice on one of the slides, each of us produces 10 tonnes of CO2 a year. So if the UK target is to reduce our levels by 80%, we've got to each save 8 tonnes of CO2 a year. Other different ways you can do this. There's very nice calculators on the web. If you go to the DEC website, there are ways you can actually calculate your personal footprint, or you can actually put in scenarios about how to navigate across this landscape from your own personal point of view. Local energy projects, more and more people if the government isn't doing things, there are cooperatives that are putting in local solar projects or combined heat and power projects. And so, there's direct action by informed groups of the public. Or you can send me a good news story and you'll get your rewards through a torch and me being able to tell the world about a story that you may think you need a platform for. So with that, thanks very much for your attention and thanks for coming this evening.
The good news is Professor Maitland is happy to take questions and, I guess, brief comments. Geoff?
Well, this is the finest lecture I've heard in years, and I have 86 of them. Geoff, what you mapped out is not just a project for the Institute of Chemical Engineering, it's also for SCI, and I would like to propose that you take the lead in trying to develop a joint programme between the two societies.
Well, as I've said, I think we should do more together. I think if this is a good platform, then...
Not more, let's do something
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah. And maybe the Energy Centre is a route to do this.
And we've set up an energy group which is just forming.
Right.
We have all activities all the way from bioscience on the one end through chemistry to chemical engineering on the other. We're a perfect partner for them.
Yes. Yeah, and by the way, anybody who's interested in getting involved with the SCI Energy Group, Geoff, you gave me the perfect lead-in for the plug. Please leave your name, your business card, or whatever there.
Actually speak to me because I'm chair of it.
Okay, I'll speak to you afterwards as well.
I would like to.
Yeah.
Yes, John?
I've got a loud voice, it's all right.
It isn't, believe me.
So I think, and you kind of touched on it a little at the end there, but one of the key problems here is incentives and timeframes. Climate change is inherently a very long time frame problem. You're talking of the order of centuries, and it's going to take a long time for us to solve it. We won't see any benefits, but in the short term, most economic and business actors are motivated by short-term gains. I mean, no one ever got elected saying we're going to make your power cost you 50% more in the next 10 years, or no business plan is going to want to have more expensive power. So how do you kind of get around this contradiction that you've got there of these two opposed incentives that you have?
Well, I think by a pincer movement, in that I think the more that the public as a whole is aware of the impending dangers of inaction, then rather like smoking and other issues, that is not a rapid process, but a gradual increase of awareness to the political pressure. Like everyone's concerned about the state of the health service, this is affecting health in not quite as personal a way to current generations, but will future generations. So there's that raised awareness. But I think we can't wait for market forces to drive this. So we've actually got to there are carbon trading systems at place, but they require political action to set the levels of carbon price. And the UK, I think, has a patchy record here. I think we had the first energy bill in the world, the legal commitment to meeting these carbon targets. As part of that, we had a base level carbon price that was introduced in the electricity bill a couple of years ago. And the intention was to ramp this up from where it is now. This is essentially how much we have to pay above the EU carbon trading price, which is sort of trailing along about 16 euros or 16, 20 euros. And so, to actually drive some of this, you need a carbon price which is up in the £30 a tonne. And you only have to go to Norway, which introduced a carbon tax 20 years ago, where the majority, well, 2 or 3 of these major near commercialisation projects are in the Norwegian North Sea. The Sleipner being the first of those, and that's been pumping in 1 million tonnes of CO2 for almost 20 years now. So you can see the effect it has when the local environment means that it's cheaper to actually do this than to actually release the CO2. But there are different... What's happened is that, in fact, rather than sticking to the original trajectory of increasing carbon prices in this country, they've now been frozen at 2015 levels for the next 5 years, which is how we see the influence of politics and opportunity on some long-term demand. So I think we need to have those levers there, and we need to actually find mechanisms to actually introduce taxation. I'm in favour of personal carbon taxes myself, that you take it down to the individual and you have the freedom to manage it, and you can also build into that the fact that not everybody can manage it and has the financial ability to actually pay that as much as others. You've got to this is where your whole socio-economics has to come together.
Okay. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for such an interesting, comprehensive lecture. I advise various companies, organisations on climate and energy policy. One of those whom I work with is the Carbon Tracker Initiative. I imagine you're familiar with their work, their research. They and others have done quite a lot to popularise the concepts like the carbon bubble, stranded assets and burnable carbon and so on. And, the basic message about the carbon bubble is that, to have a decent chance of meeting the 2 degrees threshold, we've got to keep roughly 2/3 of fossil fuels resources in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering how, listening to your thesis there, which, as far as I understood it, to some extent is about sort of stretching out our use of fossil fuels, how you think that fits with the carbon bubble concept.
Well, I think it's a nice concept if we can get it. That an obvious solution to this is we keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and then we do the best we can with the alternatives we've got. But my thesis, and it's not just my thesis, I think it's the commercialisation situation bears it out, is that if we did that in a precipitous way, it would have a drastic effect not only on our quality of life here, but it depends, whether we can impose that on developing countries who are going to not keep their fossil fuels in the ground, but are going to use them. So I don't think we should do this simply because we can't control what other countries want to do. I think we should do it if we think that maintaining the quality of life we've got now and spreading that globally, not only in terms of energy, but quality of water, health, food and everything else, which all have energy implications, that if this was that we could get away with using 10% fossil fuels, then maybe there's enough flexibility in the system to accelerate that, stop using it earlier, and we could probably survive. But this is saying that we need for the next 3 or 4 decades to use up to 50% of our energy supply to be fossil fuels. So I just don't see that we've got an alternative to keep it in the ground. We've got to use it, and therefore we have to face up to the consequences of using it, because we can't release the levels of CO2 that we have been doing. And what I've tried to spell out is that although it's a challenging problem, I think it's a manageable problem, but it's got a cost attached to it. And so the critical issue here, getting back to the previous question, is how do we distribute that cost, and whose problem is it? Is it government's problem? Is it the energy company's problem? Or is it our problem? And I say it's everybody's problem.
Yeah. Okay. Gentleman there, and then...
Yes, I have a very specific question, Jeff. You've talked about various ways we can perhaps partially or totally replace in the long term fossil fuels by other energy sources, which you very nicely outlined. And I want to address the transport industry in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of the ways of generating energy in the future involve producing electricity by one method or another.
Mm.
So if we go back to the transport industry, we now have electric cars coming on market. Instead of petrol-driven cars, we have electric trains replacing diesel trains and so on. But I've seen no one talk about electrical aircraft. Is there any source of energy we could use in the future, maybe biofuels, I guess, is the obvious one, where we can replace fossil fuels in aircraft.
Yeah, well, I think for me the future of transport is going to be a combination of electrons from wherever they come and our increased ability to store those so that maybe distances can get greater.
That's the problem with aircraft, isn't it? The battery
yes,
power to weight ratio.
but it's not ransom, but somebody's just done a flight with an electric aircraft.
It was a very small aircraft.
Well, you know, Blériot's was a small aircraft. So I think...
But it
you know,
was solar, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah. I think the fact that, you know, some of these more outlandish things are being looked at, it ought to be encouraged, but it's not going to be the solution for the rest of this century, clearly. And I do think the other part, apart from electrons, is biofuels. That in transport, it's in this country already we've got the biofuels incentive to actually top up on that, and that will be ramped up.
Well, is that going to be enough? Is that, can we produce enough biofuel for aircraft?
Well, there are going to be limitations on that, but I come back to one of the, if you like, systems points about this, is that we don't have to capture all the CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels. We just have to capture enough. Now, at the moment, we're being complacent about how enough is. You know, it's probably only about 20-25% of the CO2 we produce. So, if we had a good enough strategy about the industrial sector and the fixed asset sector, then you can see a scenario where we didn't need to worry about aircrafts. That now, I don't think we should take that line, because I think we should at least go from kerosene to something that's better than that, and more carbon neutral. But this is why, just by focusing on one sector, you go down a line that's, you end up with something that, you either chase something that's impossible and not economic to do, or you derail everything out and say, if we can't solve that sector, there's no point dealing with everything else. I don't think it's like that.
Thank you.
Okay, gentleman over there.
One of the things, sorry, how do we switch this on? One of the things you were saying was materials and the effect of petrochemicals and general materials we use in our lives all the time. But what we've seen over the last few years is a decimation of the UK heavy chemical industry, mainly because of the cost of natural gas. If we've got the opportunity for shale gas and whatever, and more cheap natural gas, my own view is what we should be doing is the same as the Saudis and the Norwegians, reserving some of this in the ground with a price that's not too high and an assured supply for the chemical industry, for us to regrow our own domestic chemical industry. Otherwise, in 30 years' time, we're going to find there's an economic argument. We're importing all our petrochemicals at a very high market price because we've got rid of all our gas because we've used it as fuel.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. That I think we just need a more strategic view of our raw materials and feedstock policy, as well as what we're doing for energy. Because I mean, if you take the problems with INEOS and the Grangemouth refinery, we're all concerned with the fact that suddenly the US has this great advantage with shale gas, and that shale gas is on the market, and you need to have technology changes in order to use that, but you base your strategy on it. So I mean, the plan there was then to actually import cheaper shale gas and use that, but also to actually acquire assets in this country to exploit shale gas in the UK, so that we regenerated the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. Now that's just, I think, just one micro example of the fact of how, without any strategic support for such an approach, something like that's happened in the last 6 months, of the oil and gas price falling off a precipice, derails something which, in terms of security and good economics for the future, makes a lot of sense and has to all be part of regenerating chemical manufacturing in this country.
That drop was engineered by the Saudis, of course, but one of the advantages we have is that we can get rid of saline water into the sea if we're expanding our chemical industry in its traditional positions around the coast.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with shale gas is saline water
Saline
disposal.
water. Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm aiming to, as they say, draw stumps at 8. So we've based the time for one brief question and one succinct response.
42 days to go to the election. We haven't had much discussion of these affairs in the campaign so far. What would you tell the person who wins at the election the day after about what they have to do and how to do it?
Well, in a short sentence, I think the UK has to have an energy strategy, which I don't believe we really have now. I think we have bits and pieces, but it's not joined up. And I think one could go for some particular bee in one's bonnet that one and be sort of partisan about it. But I think that's part of the problem, that we need a systematic overall energy policy, and then we actually need a plan of growth of this, and we need cross-party support. That, speaking to the government, we've got this spans tens, hundreds of governments, and so unless we have cross-party support on these issues, so that it doesn't matter who's in power, that we have a plan that we actually, the sooner we do it, of course, the Stern reports show that the sooner we do it, the less pain. But that message seems to have got sunk without trace. And so that's what I will be saying.
Okay.
And if I could just point out, if I may, Chad, the previous question. Oh, it's on here. It's the slide I've got on. Today's blog, day 303, is all about BASF's birthday, 150 years old today. And I think that's a sort of interesting juxtaposition of what you're saying about the state of the UK chemical industry. This major German company has maintained, has not defragmented. And the story I've got on there is that they, by actually looking at the way that they decoke all their heat exchangers on their ethanol process, that they're able to reduce their CO2 imprint on their Ludwigshafen plant by 6%, just by that one. So it's another example of how we can look at the big fruit, but you also need to look at the small fruit as well. Thank you.